Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we take a dense stack of sources and try to turn it into clear, actionable knowledge for you.
And today we are tackling a really big one. It's a book that gets right to the heart of how we govern ourselves.
We're taking an intellectually serious look at Bryan Caplan's The Myth of the Rational Voter, Why Democracies Choose Bad Policies.
And this isn't just another critique of this policy or that one. Kaplan's work, it really challenges the foundational assumptions of how democracy is even supposed to work.
So we're going to try to move past the usual left versus right arguments.
Exactly. The goal here is to examine the mechanism itself, the very system of democratic choice, and maybe most importantly, the incentives behind the beliefs that we all choose to hold as voters.
Okay, so let's start with the central puzzle that Caplan brings up. He calls it the paradox of democracy.
Right. And it's a pretty straightforward idea to start with. For centuries, the thinking was that dictatorships produce bad policies.
Sure, that makes sense. The interests of the rulers, the elite, are completely different from the interests of everyone else.
Exactly. So the obvious solution, the intuitive fix, was democracy. You give power to the people, and since their interests are now aligned with policy, you should get good policies. Simple.
But the paradox is that it doesn't always work out that way.
Not at all. It's staring us right in the face. Democracies all around the world frequently adopt and then stubbornly hold on to policies that are, demonstrably harmful to the majority, sometimes catastrophically so.
And we're talking about things that aren't even that controversial among experts.
Not at all. Think about the classic economic follies that just refuse to die. Widespread, incredibly expensive agricultural subsidies.
Protectionist tariffs that raise prices for everyone.
Or attempts at price controls, which, as we know from history, always and inevitably lead to shortages and black markets.
And what's so strange about this is that economists, from across the entire political spectrum, have been pointing this out for generations.
From Milton Friedman all the way to Paul Krugman. There's a surprising amount of consensus on the damage these policies do, yet they endure.
So that's the real question we have to answer. Why would a collective majority consistently vote against its own long-term material interests?
And that question is so important today because Caplan is really pushing you, the listener, to take a critical look at what he calls the secular religion of democracy.
The idea that we treat majority rule as this sacred, untouchable thing.
Right. But we have to remember the practical alternative to majority rule isn't just dictatorship. That's a false choice.
The other alternative is the market. Private choice.
Exactly. So if we can make a sober, evidence-based assessment of democracy's consistent flaws, then maybe the idea of shifting more decisions out of the political arena and into the private one starts to look a lot more attractive.
So that's our goal for this deep dive. A calm, systems-level analysis. We're focusing on incentives, structures, objective data, not partisan judgments.
Let's get into it.
Okay, so to really understand Caplan's big idea, we first need to understand the model he's arguing against, the traditional optimistic view from what's called public choice theory.
And that model really starts with a concept called rational ignorance.
Rational ignorance. It sounds like a contradiction, but it's actually pretty intuitive.
It is. It just says that for the average voter, it really doesn't pay to study policy in depth. Think about it. The probability that your one single vote will change the outcome of a national election is, well, it's basically zero.
The odds are astronomical.
Completely. So the cost of becoming truly informed, reading policy papers, analyzing data, it just vastly outweighs any potential private benefit. So you rationally choose to remain ignorant. It makes perfect sense.
Okay, but the classic optimists saw this coming. They had a kind of safety net for this problem, right?
They did. It's called the miracle of aggregation. And this is the comforting story that, for a long time, kept the traditional model of democracy looking pretty good.
The miracle of aggregation.
It all hinges on one single critical assumption that individual voter errors are random.
What does that mean exactly? Random errors.
Well, the classic analogy is guessing the weight of an ox. If you ask a huge crowd to guess, some will guess way too high, some will guess way too low.
Okay.
But if those errors are truly random, if there's no systematic bias in one direction, they'll all cancel each other out. And the average of all the guesses will be incredibly accurate.
I see. So the implication for democracy is that The errors of the uninformed masses just kind of wash out in the final tally?
Precisely. Policy doesn't need to be guided by every single voter, just by the well-informed ones, because their correct views aren't drowned out by the noise. The noise cancels itself out.
It sounds elegant, it sounds logical, but this is exactly where Caplan says the whole model just completely breaks down.
He says that core premise that errors are random is fundamentally wrong. His central thesis is that voters aren't just ignorant, they're irrational.
And their errors are not random. They are systematic.
They are systematic. Voters consistently make mistakes in the same predictable and ultimately policy-damaging direction.
Okay, so what's the mechanism here? Why would people systematically believe wrong things? This brings us to the idea of preferences over beliefs.
Yes, this is the core of it. Caplan argues that people often hold certain political or economic views, not just as, tools to get what they want materially.
Not just a means to an end.
No, the beliefs become ends in themselves. People derive real comfort, real psychological utility from holding a particular worldview.
So holding a belief, let's say a strong anti-corporate stance or a very nationalist view on trade, it's less about calculating the dollars and cents and more about consuming an idea.
It's like consuming an ideological good. It feels good. It's comforting. It can be flattering. It reinforces your sense of belonging to a group or your sense of moral superiority.
He calls political and economic ideology the religion of modernity.
It's a powerful comparison. Think about the words we associate with deep religious conviction. Fervent, dogmatic, fanatical. When a belief gives you that kind of psychological payoff, you will rationally choose to ignore or dismiss any evidence that threatens it.
Because the emotional benefit is just too high.
It's higher than the cognitive cost of facing up to facts that you don't like.
Which finally brings us to the formal definition of rational irrationality. How can you be rational and irrational at the same time?
It's how he reconciles the two. Rational choice theory is just about minimizing cost and maximizing benefits. So when you go into the voting booth, what's the actual material cost to you if you're wrong?
Almost nothing. Your single vote isn't going to cause the bad policy that costs you money.
Exactly. The private cost of holding and expressing a mistaken but emotionally satisfying belief is effectively zero. There is no personal penalty for being wrong.
But in the market, it's the total opposite. If I pick a bad stock or hire a terrible contractor, the mistake costs me directly. The price of error is very high.
Right. But in the voting booth, if you indulge your preference for a feel-good policy that hurts the whole economy, that cost gets spread across hundreds of millions of people. Your personal share of the damage is infinitesimal.
So you are rationally consuming an irrational belief.
You are, because the material cost to you personally is negligible, but the psychological benefit, feeling righteous or compassionate or patriotic, is high.
And this is the core challenge to the whole optimistic model. It's the reason why systematic errors don't get corrected. They persist because they feel good.
And that leads to the old programmer's warning, garbage in, garbage out. If the public's beliefs are systematically garbage, the democratic process will reliably produce garbage policies.
Okay, so if voter irrationality is, in a strange way, rational because the private cost of error is so low, we need to look at how that incentive plays out across the entire political system.
Right. Let's start by really digging into the difference between incentives in markets versus politics. The price of error.
In a market, especially a high-stakes one, like starting a business, the cost of being wrong about how the world works is immediate, and it's personal.
You, the individual, bear the full weight of that cost. So this incentivizes what Caplan calls standby rationality. You are forced to turn on your critical thinking to avoid losing your shirt.
But in politics, specifically in the voting booth, that entire structure just evaporates.
It's gone. If you hold a systematically wrong belief about, say, the benefits of tariffs, the negative results of that policy are spread so thinly across the whole population.
So the social cost is high, but my private cost is tiny.
And that gap, that huge gulf between the social and private cost of error, is what allows widespread, systematic irrationality to just flourish. You can afford to indulge your biases because everyone else is picking up the tab.
And this, Caplan argues, should completely change how we think about politicians.
Yes. The traditional criticism of politicians is about shucking, that they're lazy or corrupt and they're just not doing what the public wants.
But Caplan says we should be focused on demagoguery instead.
Precisely. If you accept the premise that the average voter is like a religious devotee, credulous, attached to certain prejudices, then the politician faces this incredibly powerful incentive.
not just to listen to the public, but to exploit those very biases.
They're incentivized to do what's popular, which means validating all the public's feel-good fallacies. But they have almost no incentive to deliver competent, beneficial policy results if those results require some kind of painful truth.
So the rule of demagogues, then leaders who ride waves of popular illusion instead of challenging them, that's not some occasional bug in the system.
He argues it's the natural condition of democracy. It's a feature. And it's not just about cynical actors either. The system actually encourages the sincerely prejudiced to enter politics.
The people who actually believe the popular fallacies themselves.
Exactly, because they're naturally better at communicating that popular narrative with conviction. Meanwhile, the politician who tries to be the enlightened educator, the one who stands up and explains the inconvenient truth about trade or deficits,
They're committing political suicide.
they risk electoral death. They lose votes by trying to take away the public's comforting illusions. It's a one-way street. Preaching truth is costly, but preaching popular error gets you reelected.
Okay, so if politicians' hands are tied by these powerful public prejudices, where does that leave interest groups? The usual story is that they're the ones subverting democracy.
Caplan has a more nuanced take. He says interest groups are smart. They know they can't just overturn a deeply held public prejudice, no matter how much money they spend.
So what do?
They operate on the margins. They find the areas of public indifference, what he calls the wiggle room, where people don't really have a strong ideological belief one way or the other.
Can you give us an example of that distinction?
Sure. Think about ethanol production. A lobby for ethanol producers might be very successful in getting some complex, opaque tax credit passed. The public is mostly indifferent, or maybe they vaguely think it's good for farmers. They haven't really consumed a strong ideological belief on that specific topic. But that same lobby, with all the money in the world, could never successfully get gasoline banned.
Because that would step on a deeply held, visceral public preference for being able to drive their cars.
Exactly. The systematic irrationality of the voters actually sets the boundaries for what kind of corruption or influence is even possible. Interest groups can exploit a vacuum of knowledge, but they can't override a deeply felt bias.
They're limited to the technical areas, the stuff people don't really think about.
Right. Banking regulations, agricultural quotas, they can get their slice of the pie there. But they can't enact pure loot policies if those policies directly contradict a popular, cherished illusion.
Okay, finally, let's look at the role of the media. We usually think of the media as this neutral watchdog, correcting all these public misperceptions.
And they do have a watchdog function, sure, scandal cells. But Caplan argues the media's role is fundamentally subordinate. It's driven by consumer demand.
Meaning,
Meaning, in a competitive media landscape, if your news coverage, no matter how accurate, conflicts with your viewers' core irrational beliefs,
they just change the channel.
they change the channel. And that creates this powerful feedback loop. The market pressures the media to cater to pre-existing beliefs, even if those beliefs are systematically wrong.
So instead of correcting economic fallacies, they might end up reinforcing them.
It leads to reinforcing fallacies, to sensationalism over substance, to simple narratives like blaming greedy CEOs instead of explaining complex truths like comparative advantage. The media isn't some independent corrective force. It's just another part of the system that caters to the rational demand for comforting illusions.
The strength of this entire argument really depends on the evidence. The idea that these voter errors aren't just mistakes, but are deeply ingrained systematic biases.
Right, and Caplan identifies 4 major ones, especially when it comes to economics. Let's spend some time on each of these, starting with the anti-market bias.
Anti-market bias.
This is the deep-seated tendency to underestimate the benefits of the market mechanism. The public, he argues, overwhelmingly focuses on the motives of business profit, which they often see as greed.
And in doing so, they miss the bigger picture.
They completely neglect the crucial impersonal discipline of competition, which is the force that steers all that self-interested action toward outcomes that are actually good for society.
This shows up most clearly in how people think about profit, right?
Absolutely. The public tends to see successful greed as just inherently bad. They equate market payments like corporate profit or a CEO salary with a simple transfer.
Like a zero-sum game, taking money from the poor and giving it to the rich.
Exactly. If profit is just a slice of a fixed pie being handed to the wealthy, then of course you'd want to limit it. What gets completely missed are the incentive properties of profit. Profit is a signal. It tells people where to allocate resources. It's what motivates innovation. It's the engine of progress.
You can even see this bias historically.
For sure. Think about the historical prejudice against usury, against charging interest. The moneylender was seen as an exploiter, not performing any real work.
And that distrust continues today with middlemen.
Yes, that's a perfect example. Whether it's stockbrokers or wholesalers or even ticket scalpers, the public often has this hostility. The belief is that value is only created by physical labor growing the food, making the product.
Not by coordinating or managing risk or connecting buyers and sellers efficiently.
They see the person who buys low and sells high as a vicious monopolist, when in reality, that middleman is making the entire system more efficient for everyone. But that prejudice, that only physical labor creates value, it just fuels this anti-market sentiment.
You also mentioned the opposition to things like tradable pollution permits.
A classic case. The economic logic is sound. You cap total pollution and then let the market set the price. This incentivizes the firms that can cut emissions most cheaply to do so first, which achieves the environmental goal at the lowest possible cost to society.
But the public hates it.
They hate it because they don't see the permit as an incentive. They see it as paying for the right to pollute, which feels morally wrong. It conflicts with the feeling that pollution should be punished, not optimized.
Okay, the second major bias is the anti-foreign bias.
This one is pretty straightforward. It's the systematic tendency to underestimate the economic benefits we get from interacting with foreigners, especially through trade.
The common metaphor is always war or a race.
Exactly. A zero-sum game. If they're winning, we must be losing. It goes back to the old mistake that Adam Smith pointed out centuries ago, confusing money with actual wealth. Wealth is the goods and services you can consume.
So if money drains out of the country to buy foreign goods, the popular logic is that we're getting poorer.
Right, completely ignoring the massive inflow of actual goods and services that we got in exchange. This prejudice also ignores the fundamental law of comparative advantage.
Which says that trade can be mutually beneficial even if one country is better at producing everything.
As long as there's a difference in the relative efficiency, specialization and trade make both sides better off. But that's a complex idea. The emotional zero-sum frame is just so much easier to grasp, and the data shows it's not just about distance, it's about difference. People distrust trade with countries that don't look like us more than trade with culturally similar ones.
The third systematic error, the make-work bias. Caplan calls it Sisyphism.
After the Greek myth, yes. This bias is the deep-seated fear that saving labor is dangerous. An economist sees a new technology that lets us produce more with fewer workers and calls it progress.
The public sees it and worries about job destruction.
They view the main goal of an economy as maintaining existing jobs, no matter how inefficient or useless those jobs might be.
This is the Luddite fear of machines, but we see it today with things like corporate downsizing or even AI.
Definitely. The economic truth is that using more workers than you need is a waste of a precious resource, human talent. When technology displaces a worker, yes, it causes temporary hardship for that person, but it permanently frees up their labor to be used in some new, more valuable way.
Doing more with less is the definition of progress.
It is, but the public resists this. They only see the job that was lost, not the new ones that are created elsewhere in the economy as a result. They prefer, in a way, endless toil over technological advancement.
And the fourth and final bias, pessimistic bias.
This is the tendency to systematically underestimate how well the economy has done, is doing, and will do. The public is in a constant state of worry about decline and collapse, ignoring centuries of overwhelming evidence of progress.
So it's not just healthy skepticism, it's a chronic misjudgment.
It is. It shows up as exaggerating current problems. The deficit is always an existential crisis. Unemployment is always worse than the numbers say, and at the same time romanticizing the past. A belief that the good old days were materially better, which is almost never true.
People focus on the small, visible setbacks.
And they take the massive long-term progress completely for granted. Adam Smith famously said, "There's a great deal of ruin in a nation," meaning an economy can withstand a huge amount of bad policy and still grow. But the public remains convinced we're always just one step away from disaster.
Now for the hard evidence. How does Caplan actually prove these errors are systematic and not just random noise? He uses this methodology for estimating enlightened preferences.
Right. This is where it gets really rigorous. We move from theory to statistical analysis. The idea is to figure out what the public would want if they were fully informed. It's a three-step process.
Okay, step one.
First, you survey the public, you ask them their policy preferences, but you also give them a tough, objective test of political knowledge, a kind of political IQ test.
So you measure what they believe, and you also measure how much they actually know about the relevant facts.
Exactly. Step two is you build a statistical model. You see how people's policy preferences change as their political knowledge goes up, while controlling for everything else, their income, age, gender, ideology.
So the model essentially asks, if we could magically give this person a PhD in economics, what would your policy preferences look like, keeping everything else about them the same?
That's the idea. And step three is the simulation. You use the model to calculate the policy preferences of the enlightened public, what the public would believe if everyone got a perfect score on the knowledge test.
So what does the data show? What happens when you enlighten the public?
The key finding is just overwhelming. The effects of knowledge on policy preferences are huge, and they're everywhere. The opinions of the uninformed are not random. They are systematically biased, usually in the same direction, and they're almost always more one-sided than the opinions of the well-informed.
Scott Althos did a summary of these patterns, which is really crucial here.
Yes, he found three main areas where things shift. First, on foreign policy, the enlightened public is a bit more interventionist, less isolationist, but also a bit less hawkish. They see more complexity and more downside to war.
Second, social policy.
Here, the shift is clearly in a progressive direction. The fully informed opinion is more supportive of things like gay rights and abortion rights.
But the biggest shift, and the one that's most important for Caplan's argument, is in economic policy.
On economic policy, the enlightened opinion is significantly more ideologically conservative. The enlightened public strongly favors free market solutions over government intervention.
Even when you control for their income.
Especially then. As objective knowledge goes up, people at all income levels become more pro-market. In fact, the pro-market shift is disproportionately large in the bottom half of the income distribution.
That's fascinating. So it completely refutes the simple idea that people just vote their pocketbooks. It's not that knowledge makes rich people better at protecting their wealth.
No, it suggests that a better understanding of economics changes your fundamental beliefs about what works, regardless of your personal situation.
And this is confirmed by the survey of Americans and economists on the economy, the SAE data.
That data is the smoking gun. It compares the general public, professional economists, and the statistically created enlightened public. The beliefs of the enlightened public line up almost perfectly with the economists, not with the general public.
So the gap between what the public believes and what economists believe isn't about ideology or self-interest.
Very little of it is. Those factors account for maybe 20% of the belief gap. The other 80% is attributable purely to knowledge. It's a massive confirmation of the rational irrationality thesis.
Let's just pull out a couple of specific data points that really show these biases in action.
Okay, take the anti-market bias. The public wildly overestimates business profits. The average guess for a typical company's profit margin is nearly 50%.
Which is insane.
It's grossly inflated. Economists know this, and the enlightened public agrees with the economists. And that inflated view of profit is what fuels the perception that profits and executive pay are just theft, rather than something that drives the economy.
And what about the make-work bias? The data on downsizing must show a huge split.
A massive divide. The public sees corporate downsizing as just plain bad. Economists and the enlightened public see it as a net positive for society as a whole. It's doing more with less.
The very definition of progress.
Right. And even when you ask about the effects 20 years down the line from new technology or downsizing, the public thinks the benefits will fade or never show up at all. The economists see pure long-term gain. It's this repeated pattern that shows low knowledge scores point directly to systematic policy incompetence, all driven by these psychological biases.
Okay, if the evidence really shows that voters are systematically irrational, the consequences for how we view democracy are, well, they're profound.
They really are. And we have to start with what might be the most counterintuitive finding of all: the complete failure of the self-interested voter hypothesis, or SIVH.
The idea that people just vote their pocketbooks.
It just doesn't hold up. When you look at the data, the correlations are incredibly weak. Your income level is only loosely related to which party you vote for.
And you mentioned earlier that seniors aren't disproportionately more supportive of Social Security.
That's right, even though they are the direct beneficiaries. The simple desire for a bigger paycheck just doesn't reliably predict how people vote on policy.
But wait a minute. If voters aren't voting selfishly, then what are they doing?
This is the massive twist. The crucial implication is that voters are predominantly sociotropic.
Meaning they're motivated to do what they think is best for society as a whole. They're trying to be altruistic in the voting booth.
And this is the central paradox. Why are they altruistic? It's because altruism is cheap. Like any other good, you buy more of it when the price is low.
And the price of voting for a policy that hurts you personally is almost zero.
The expected material cost is practically nothing. If a policy would cost you $10,000 in new taxes, but your vote only has a 1 in a million chance of being the deciding one, the expected cost to you is a single penny.
So for a penny, I get to purchase the good feeling of being compassionate or morally righteous.
You're rationally purchasing cheap altruism. You're not a philanthropist donating a huge sum. You're just buying a good feeling at an incredible discount.
And here's the perverse outcome. This voter altruism actually amplifies the damage from the systematic errors.
It's the amplifier. If voters were purely selfish, their bad ideas might be held in check. Rich voters might selfishly oppose a popular but harmful policy, and their votes might cancel out the irrational public demand.
But because everyone is trying to vote for what they perceive to be the national interest.
There's systematic errors, like the belief that tariffs are good for everyone, are given a moral justification, and those errors get translated directly and powerfully into destructive national policies.
The voter is trying to be good, but because their map of the world is wrong, their good intentions pave the road to bad outcomes.
And this leads directly to the impossible situation politicians find themselves in. The perverse trade-off.
They're caught between a rock and a hard place.
Completely. The public irrationally demands a specific policy, say strict rent control, but then they universally hate the predictable negative consequences that follow, like housing shortages.
So the politician is damned if they do, damned if they don't.
Exactly. If the politician ignores the public's biased demands, they're seen as corrupt or out of touch. But if they actually implement what the public wants, they're seen as incompetent when the bad results inevitably show up.
And the voters hate those results.
This structural paradox, voters wanting policy X but hating result Y when X always leads to Y, is the key reason for the high, persistent public dissatisfaction we see with elected leaders in all democracies. Voters are dissatisfied because they are demanding contradictions.
Given all this, why isn't democracy even worse than it is? Caplan points to a few systemic safety valves that sort of dilute the poison.
Right. The first one is selective participation or turnout.
The people who actually show up to vote are not a random sample of the population.
Not at all. Voters tend to be richer, older, and most importantly for this argument, they tend to be better educated. And we already know that education correlates strongly with economic literacy and political knowledge.
So the median voter is actually less biased than the median citizen.
That's right. So even though this widens the gap between what the total public wants and what it gets,
It narrows the gap between what the public gets and what it actually needs to prosper.
it's like a small aristocratic filter on a democratic process. The people who are more informed have their voices amplified, and that partially mitigates the damage that would be caused if everyone voted.
The second safety valve is a really interesting twist. He calls it delegation and agency problems, or wiggle room.
Yeah, this is the idea that voters systematically underestimate how much control a leader has over their subordinates, the judges, the bureaucrats, the agency heads.
And that lack of oversight creates a kind of necessary slack in the system.
It does. The politician can go out and cater to public prejudice in their speeches, loudly denounce foreign imports to win votes, while quietly allowing their subordinates to make better, more sensible decisions behind the scenes.
So the famous agency problem, the idea that the agent, the bureaucrat, doesn't do what the principal wants, that actually becomes a good thing.
It acts as a crucial check on populism. The politician gets the credit for the popular gesture, but the agency heads can temper the extremes. They can save the economy or protect civil liberties by moving slowly or implementing smarter policies through complex regulations that the public doesn't pay attention to.
And we can see this same principle at work in other areas, like toxicology.
Toxicology is a great parallel. The public holds another systematic bias here. They focus on exposure at all instead of the dose.
The idea that any trace amount of a chemical is equally dangerous.
Right. They reject the fundamental toxicological truth that the poison is in the dosage. They operate under a doseless worldview.
And if politicians actually implemented policy based on that worldview, The economic costs would be astronomical.
They'd be catastrophic. We'd waste vast resources eliminating tiny, low-risk dangers. So politicians are forced, reluctantly, to drag their feet on some of the most costly environmental regulations. They act as an institutional check against the public's irrationality in that space as well.
Okay, a thesis this radical is bound to have some serious critiques. We have to address the strongest alternative explanations, starting with the expressive voting model.
Right, this is often associated with Jeffrey Brennan and Lauren Lemaski. They agree with Caplan that the cost of error in voting is near zero, and so voters vote to express an identity, their compassion, their nationalism.
But there's a key difference.
A huge difference.
Yeah.
The expressive model argues that voters know the policies they support are bad. They're consciously choosing to feel good over getting good results. They're voting for disaster just to wave the flag.
So how does Kaplan's rational irrationality model differ?
The distinction is empirical. Caplan argues his model is more credible because people who support these feel-good policies also hold false descriptive views. The rationally irrational protectionist genuinely believes that tariffs make the country richer.
They're not just signaling. They actually believe the faulty premise.
Exactly. If they truly believed the policy was harmful, it wouldn't provide the psychological utility of confirming their worldview. It's a bias of belief, not just a preference for signaling an identity.
Okay, a second big critique tries to save the traditional model. It's the idea that voters use shortcuts or heuristics, things like party labels, or just judging the economy retrospectively.
The inarticulate knowledge argument. The idea that even if they can't pass a quiz, they have a kind of gut wisdom that leads them to make functionally rational choices.
What's the rebuttal to that?
The rebuttal is powerful, and it comes from the very enlightened preference research we just talked about. If these shortcuts actually worked, then an ill-informed person using a heuristic should end up with policy preferences similar to a truly well-informed person.
But the data shows they don't.
Not even close. The policy preferences of the uninformed are systematically different from the informed. The shortcuts do not lead them to the wise position. The low test scores point to genuine policy incompetence, not some hidden, inarticulate wisdom.
Now for the more political attacks. Kaplan and economists in general are often accused of market fundamentalism.
Right. The charge that economists are just ideologically biased toward markets and that they ignore market failures.
How does he respond to that?
He argues it's not even a good caricature of mainstream economics. Economists spend their entire careers studying market failures, public goods, externalities, monopolies. They get rewarded professionally for discovering new market failures.
So the concept of market failure is internal to the field.
It's a core part of the discipline. The true market fundamentalists who deny any role for government are a tiny fringe, not the professional consensus.
Instead, Kaplan says the real bias we should worry about is democratic fundamentalism.
This is the secular religion he mentioned, the belief that all the ills of democracy can be cured by more democracy. It's the reflexive idea that the quality of a political outcome must itself be judged by a vote.
So it makes any structural critique of democracy seem like a form of heresy.
Completely. It views any limit on pure majority rule like a constitution or judicial review or supermajority requirements as a betrayal of the democratic ideal.
It uses that Churchill, quote, worst form of government except for all the others, to just shut down the conversation.
Right. It shuts down any sober comparison of democracy's flaws relative to the flaws of market alternatives. The dogma rejects moving decisions out of the political sphere, no matter how much evidence there is that the political sphere consistently messes them up.
There's a perfect case study of this in action. The public reaction to the policy analysis market, which the media quickly nicknamed the terror market.
Ah, yes, PM. This was a small-scale futures market set up by the Defense Department. The idea was to use financial incentives to get more accurate predictions about geopolitical risks.
And the evidence from other prediction markets is that they often work incredibly well.
They often outperform expert panels because the price of error is high. If you bet wrong, you lose your own money, which forces you to be rational.
But the political reaction was immediate and hostile.
Instantaneous. Politicians and the media condemned it as morally repugnant and gambling on terrorism without ever engaging with the scientific logic behind it. The program was killed within 24 hours of the controversy starting.
And that reaction is pure democratic fundamentalism.
It's the purest form. They rejected an evidence-based, incentive-driven alternative purely on anti-market dogma. They couldn't stand the idea of subjecting traditional intelligence gathering to competition from a market because that might reveal the incompetence of the traditional method.
It all brings us back to Kaplan's final point, thinking about private choice as the third alternative.
If democratic policy is consistently undermined by these systematic biases, the logical, systems-level response is to shrink the domain of democracy, to rely more on private markets and individual choice.
Because in the market, the price of error is high enough to force people back into their standby rationality.
Right. He suggests that just as the majority doesn't get to vote on your religion, maybe there are large areas of economic and personal life that should also be removed from the political realm, that would force individuals to bear the cost of their own mistakes, which would improve outcomes for everyone.
So let's bring this all together. Let's revisit that core question we started with. Why do democracies so often choose bad policies?
At the end of the day, the argument is that the policies are bad not because our politicians are corrupt and not just because voters are ignorant.
Right.
It's because voters rationally choose to hold on to systematically biased beliefs.
Because those beliefs feel good, and the political system is perfectly designed to reward those comforting illusions.
I think we can boil it down to 3 key takeaways for you. First, voter irrationality is a choice. It's a rational choice driven by the fact that the private cost of being wrong in the voting booth is near zero.
Second, and this is the big surprise, voters are altruistic. They are sociotropic. But this good intention paradoxically acts as an amplifier for their systematic errors, turning their feel-good fallacies into real-world bad policy.
And third, the evidence is strong that the public systematically suffers from those 4 major biases: anti-market, anti-foreign, make-work, and pessimistic, all of which push policy away from what works and toward what feels good.
We should also stress the open questions here, the uncertainty.
Absolutely. The big challenge is figuring out the causal link. Is education just a proxy for raw intelligence, meaning the problem is basically unsolvable? Or can we actively root out these biases by changing what we teach in schools?
Teaching more economics, statistics, and maybe evolutionary biology, as some have suggested.
It's an open question. And the ultimate implication for how we should govern ourselves is a matter of relative performance. The question isn't whether democracy is perfect. It's about how its flaws stack up against the flaws of the alternatives, especially private choice.
Where the high price of error foiled as a kind of rationality that benefits everyone.
The final provocative thought we want to leave you with goes right back to that price of irrationality. Think about this global puzzle.
Okay.
Citizens of poor countries are often desperate to migrate to rich countries for a better life. We see this every day. Yet those same citizens rarely, if ever, vote for political parties in their home countries that pledge to copy the policies of those rich countries. Why? Why the political schizophrenia?
The answer has to be about incentives.
It's all about the cost. To migrate, you have to pay a huge personal cost. You have to give up the psychological comfort of your worldview, your nationalism, your traditions, your cherished biases, in exchange for material prosperity.
But voting against reform back home is free.
It costs you nothing. You get to keep the psychological payoff of your feel-good worldview without paying any personal price for it. And that ensures the cycle of bad policy continues, overemphasizing the psychological comfort of the citizens at the direct expense of their material standard of living.
The source for this deep dive was the challenging and I think essential book, The Myth of the Rational Voter: Why Democracies Choose Bad Policies by Bryan Caplan.
We really encourage you to read the book for yourself. Or check your local library to dig into these provocative ideas and the data behind them.
And a shorter mini-explainer version of this analysis is also available if you're looking for a quick refresher. We always invite your suggestions for future topics we can dive into. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.